It started as a bright autumn morning full of laughter and excitement. A yellow school bus, filled with 13 children, left the small town of Maple Creek for what was supposed to be a simple field trip. But that bus, and every child on board, vanished without a trace. Maple Creek, British Columbia, September 14th, 1987. The leaves had just begun to turn golden, and the air carried the crisp scent of early fall. Parents waved from the sidewalk as the big yellow bus rolled down Main Street, its windows filled with smiling faces. The children were headed to a nature reserve just 40 kilometers away, a trip they had been talking about for weeks. But by nightfall, panic gripped the entire town. The bus never returned. The initial search was swift and intense. Police, volunteers, and even military helicopters scoured the forests, rivers, and back roads. But there were no skid marks, no debris, no tire tracks leading away from the route. It was as if the bus had simply driven off the face of the earth. For years, rumors swirled, whispers of kidnappings, strange lights in the woods, and an old mine shaft said to be cursed. Yet no evidence ever surfaced, ever. Then in 2005, 18 years after the disappearance, two wilderness explorers stumbled upon something deep in the forest that would reignite the case and send chills through everyone who remembered that day. The morning of September 14th, 1987, began like any other in Maple Creek, a quiet logging town in British Columbia with fewer than 3,000 residents. Nestled between thick pine forests and winding mountain roads, life here moved at a steady, predictable pace. Parents knew their neighbors, children played freely in the streets, and the sound of chainsaws from the nearby mill was as common as the chirping of birds. That Monday, however, carried an extra dose of excitement. The Grade 6 and Grade 7 classes of Maple Creek Elementary were going on their long-awaited autumn field trip to Elk Valley Nature Reserve. For many of these kids, it would be their first time leaving town without their parents. At 8:15 a.m., the bus pulled up in front of the school. It was an old but reliable International Harvester model, painted a cheerful bright yellow. The driver, 54-year-old Howard Miller, had been behind the wheel of school buses for over 2 decades. Parents trusted him. He was the kind of man who knew every child's name and sometimes brought extra snacks for the long rides. One by one, 13 children climbed aboard. Witnesses remember them pressed against the windows, waving as their parents stood on the curb, smiling and snapping photos. Among them was 12-year-old Emily Foster, wearing her favorite red sweater, and 11-year-old twins Michael and Matthew Thompson, known for their constant laughter. By 8:25, the bus rumbled down Main Street and turned onto Highway 19, heading east toward the nature reserve. It was the last confirmed sighting anyone would have of the children and of Howard Miller. When the bus didn't return by the scheduled 4:30 p.m., the school secretary called Howard's home. His wife hadn't seen him since morning. By 6:00 p.m., worried parents were gathered in the school parking lot. The sun dipped below the tree line, and a creeping sense of dread began to settle in. By nightfall, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police had set up a command post. They sent search parties down every possible road and trail leading to Elk Valley. Helicopters circled overhead with floodlights. Divers searched nearby rivers and lakes. Yet there was no trace. Not a single piece of clothing. No tire tracks veering off the main road. No broken branches suggesting the bus had crashed. By the end of the first week, the town of Maple Creek had transformed from a peaceful community into a place wrapped in fear and unanswered questions. And as months turned into years, the disappearance of the Maple Creek 13 became one of Canada's most haunting unsolved mysteries, until nearly 2 decades later, when the forest finally gave up one of its secrets. It was late July of 2005 when the first clue in nearly 2 decades surfaced, and it happened entirely by accident. 2 amateur explorers, brothers Daniel and Luke Patterson, had set out that morning with backpacks, GPS devices, and a vague plan to map abandoned logging trails in the northern section of Elk Valley. This part of the reserve had been closed for years due to dangerous terrain and overgrowth. But the Pattersons weren't the type to shy away from a challenge. By mid-afternoon, the brothers had already navigated knee-deep mud, crossed a decaying wooden bridge, and followed a deer trail that wound deeper into the forest than either of them had ever gone. That's when Daniel stopped dead in his tracks. "Luke, do you hear that?" It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was the faint metallic creak of something shifting in the distance, a sound so out of place in the middle of untouched forest that it sent chills up their spines. They followed the noise, pushing through walls of wet foliage until the trees opened into a small clearing. At first, it looked like nothing more than a mound of earth covered in vines and moss. But then the faded curve of yellow paint emerged from beneath the greenery. It was a bus. The front end was half buried in soil, as if the forest had tried to swallow it whole. Rust streaked the metal like tears, and the glass in the windshield was shattered, with jagged edges catching the light. Daniel pulled out his camera and began recording. "This can't be real, it's got to be some old logging bus." But Luke stepped closer and froze. The faded black lettering on the side was still visible, though barely. Maple Creek School, District 14. Heart pounding, Daniel circled to the front. A large section of the windshield had been smeared from the inside with something brownish red, now dark and dry with age. And in the middle of the grime, carved into the glass with something sharp, were two words that would shake the entire town when they were revealed. "Help us." The moment the words "help us" came into focus on Daniel's camera screen, he felt his stomach drop. Luke backed away instinctively, scanning the silent forest as if expecting someone or something to emerge from the shadows. "We need to call someone," Luke whispered. Within hours, the Elk Valley RCMP arrived, their cruisers and unmarked SUVs kicking up clouds of dust on the dirt road before stopping at the nearest trailhead. Officers hiked in with crime scene tape, evidence kits, and 2 search dogs, while Daniel and Luke watched from a distance. The forest seemed to grow quieter with every step toward the clearing, as if it knew what was about to be uncovered. One of the officers climbed the bus's rusted side steps, his flashlight cutting through the darkness inside. Almost immediately, his voice came over the radio. "Dispatch, we've got something here." The first thing they noticed was the smell, a stale, suffocating odor of mold, decay, and something metallic. The seats were torn and covered in dirt and leaves, but what made everyone freeze were the objects scattered on the floor. Tiny sneakers caked with mud, a faded pink backpack with a broken zipper, a stack of children's books warped by years of damp air. In the back row, under a thick layer of rotting fabric, they found something worse, a child's drawing, laminated in clear plastic, as if someone had tried to preserve it. It showed a yellow bus in the middle of a forest, surrounded by stick figures with sad faces, and above them, in crude red crayon, the words, "We can't leave." No bodies were found that day, but the RCMP knew one thing. Whatever had happened here, it hadn't been an accident. By the second day, the clearing was buzzing with activity. Crime scene tents had been set up, and floodlights bathed the rusted bus in a harsh white glow even after sunset. The RCMP had brought in a forensics excavation team, suspecting there might be more hidden under the soil. Shovels and small trowels scraped through the damp earth beneath the front of the bus. The ground was unusually soft, as if it had been disturbed before. Every few minutes, one of the officers would pause, glance at the lead investigator and shake their head, until one of the search dogs let out a sharp, urgent bark. "Over here," a forensic tech called out. The digging shifted to a concentrated patch near the left wheel well. Soon the blade of a shovel hit something solid. The team switched to brushes, carefully sweeping away the dirt, until a large, weathered metal box began to emerge from the earth. It was about the size of a small trunk, covered in rust and wrapped in what appeared to be layers of plastic sheeting. The box was hauled out and placed gently on a tarp. Every officer standing nearby seemed to hold their breath as a bolt cutter sliced through the corroded padlock. When the lid creaked open, a sickening silence fell over the clearing. Inside were dozens of small personal items, bracelets, hair ribbons, and name tags from a school trip. But under those objects was something even more disturbing, a stack of Polaroid photographs, each one showing a group of children inside this very bus, with someone standing just out of frame. The photographs were carefully laid out on a folding evidence table under the forensic lights. Even through the blur and faded colors of decades-old Polaroids, the children's faces were clear, laughing, waving, unaware of the fate that awaited them. Detective Laura Mackenzie leaned over the table, studying each image. The timestamps on the edges, though faint, matched the week the children vanished in 1984. But it wasn't the smiling faces that held her attention. It was the partial silhouette that appeared in almost every frame. In some photos, it was just a sliver of a shoulder. In others, the outline of a hand gripping the back of a bus seat. And in one, the clearest of all, the shadow fell across a child's lap, revealing a rough plaid sleeve and the faint glint of a wristwatch. "Do we have any idea who this could be?" one of the forensic techs asked. "Not yet," Laura replied, her voice tight. "But I think we just found our first lead in 18 years. She flipped through the photos again, her eyes narrowing. The watch had a distinctive design, a thick metal band and a rectangular face with a crack across the glass. Something about it tugged at her memory, though she couldn't place it yet. Meanwhile, officers began to dig further under the bus, suspecting that more evidence, or worse, might still be hidden. And as the search continued, one of the RCMP divers emerged from the nearby swamp with a waterlogged, mud-covered object clutched in his hands. The object the diver held was heavy, dripping with black water and tangled in roots. He laid it carefully onto a plastic tarp, and the muddy outline began to take shape. Detective Mackenzie crouched down, brushing away the muck with her gloved hands. It was an old leather satchel, its straps rotted, the brass buckle green with corrosion. She unfastened it slowly, half expecting it to fall apart. Inside, wrapped in layers of decayed fabric, were papers, dozens of them, protected enough by the folds to still be legible. The top page made Laura's pulse quicken. It was a handwritten list, names, all 13 children, neatly lined in blue ink, with dates and strange notes scribbled beside each. Some entries had a single word, taken, moved, waiting. Others had nothing but a dash. "Where exactly did you find this?" Laura asked, her voice sharp. "Wedged under the front axle of the bus, ma'am," the diver replied, almost like someone didn't want it to float away. Beneath the list, there were more documents, maps of the forest, with hand-drawn circles, a Polaroid of the bus from a distance, and, most disturbing of all, a close-up photo of a child's shoe half buried in dirt. Laura felt the weight of it all pressing down. Whoever had kept this record wasn't just involved. They were organized, methodical. This wasn't a random tragedy. It had been planned. And then, at the bottom of the satchel, her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. Laura pulled the object free from the bottom of the satchel, and a shiver ran down her spine. It was a large, old-fashioned key, heavy, iron, and unlike anything she had ever seen in her years on the force. Its bow was ornate, carved with tiny, deliberate markings that looked almost like coordinates. "Could be for a lockbox or maybe something bigger," Sergeant Howard muttered, leaning closer. Laura turned the key over in her hand, her mind racing. If it had been hidden with the list and maps, it had to be important. The problem was, there were no obvious locks anywhere near the bus, nothing that this key could open. She glanced again at the diver's map, the one showing where the bus had been buried. Then her eyes fell on the hand-drawn circles in the recovered documents. They weren't random. Each was connected by a thin, penciled line leading away from the bus site deeper into the forest. One circle in particular had been drawn over and over, darker than the rest, as if the writer had wanted to make sure no one could miss it. And beside it, a single word in block letters, entry. Her gut told her this key was meant for whatever lay there. "Gear up," she said, tucking the satchel under her arm. "We're moving out before the light's gone." Somewhere beyond that tree line, the forest was holding its final secret, and Laura was about to open it. The team moved quickly, following the crude map through uneven ground and thick undergrowth. The forest seemed to grow darker with every step, even though the sun was still high. Laura's boots sank into damp earth, and the air was heavy with the scent of moss and decay. After nearly an hour of trudging through the dense foliage, Howard stopped abruptly and pointed ahead. "There," he whispered. Half hidden behind a curtain of vines was what looked like the entrance to a bunker. Concrete walls weathered by decades, its surface mottled with moss. An iron door, streaked with rust, stood in the center. Laura's heart pounded. She stepped closer and saw a padlock unlike any she'd ever encountered, ornate, hand-forged, and perfectly matching the style of the key she carried. "This is it," she murmured. The moment the key slid into the lock, it turned with a slow, echoing click. The heavy door groaned as she pushed it open, sending a stale wave of air rushing out from the darkness inside. A narrow staircase spiraled down into the earth, lit only by the weak beam of Laura's flashlight. As the light swept over the walls, faded children's drawings appeared, crayon pictures of houses, trees, and smiling faces, now smudged and yellowed with time. Howard's voice was barely a whisper. "Laura, what is this place?" She didn't answer. Deep down, she feared she already knew. The investigation into the rusted, half-buried bus intensified. Forensic teams swarmed the site, their gloved hands carefully extracting every possible clue. The air was thick with anticipation and dread, every step echoing the weight of 18 years of unanswered questions. Inside, the interior told a silent, chilling story. Rusted seats were bent and broken, as if there had been a struggle. On the dusty floor, a child's shoe, small, red, and faded, lay near the back, its laces still tied neatly. It was a heartbreaking sight that made seasoned investigators pause in silence. In the overhead luggage racks, they found a weathered backpack containing school notebooks from the early 80s. The pages were yellowed, but one stood out. A list of names, the same 13 children who had vanished. The writing ended abruptly mid-page, as if interrupted. The most unsettling discovery came from the front of the bus, a message scratched into the metal near the driver's seat. "Don't follow the river." The letters were jagged and desperate, carved deep into the steel. This cryptic warning sent shivers down everyone's spine. Why the river? And who had left the message? Search teams expanded their investigation to the nearby waterway, a winding, dark river hidden by thick forest canopies. Locals claimed the river had a curse, tied to old tragedies from decades before. But now those tales no longer felt like mere superstition. Whatever had happened 18 years ago, the answer was drawing closer. And the forest seemed almost alive, as if guarding the final terrible truth. The river search began at dawn. A team of divers entered the dark, murky waters, their flashlights cutting through the sediment-filled current. Hours passed before one diver surfaced, signaling frantically. They had found something lodged beneath a tangle of submerged roots, a large, rusted metal box. Carefully, it was brought ashore and pried open. Inside were personal belongings, hair ribbons, wristwatches, and small lunchboxes, all marked with the names of the 13 missing children. But that wasn't all. At the bottom lay a bundle of old photographs, water-damaged but still visible. The images in the background of some photos stood a man in a dark jacket, his face partially obscured. Forensic analysis confirmed what investigators had feared. He was a local driver who had volunteered to assist on the school trip back in 1984. He had vanished from the community just days after the children disappeared. A week later, deep in the forest, search teams found what appeared to be a collapsed underground chamber, its wooden supports rotted away. Inside, they discovered skeletal remains confirmed to be the 13 missing children. The truth was unbearable. Lured away from the main group, they had been trapped when the chamber caved in. The community held a memorial, laying the children to rest together. For 18 years, the mystery had haunted the town. Now, though the pain would never fade, the families finally had answers, and a place to say goodbye.